Judge Walter Grayson narrowed his eyes, holding back a sigh. He had stood on this bench long enough to know when a lost teenager was just a fool, and when he knew exactly what he was doing. He had initially thought Jalen Dawson belonged to the former group, until he began tearing up the case, with the air of a seasoned attorney. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The rows of spectators were whispering nervously as they watched the young man face the entire legal system. Under the dim yellow lights of the courtroom, Jalen stood tall, not the least bit afraid. The defendant's table looked too big for his skinny frame, but his gaze was filled with confidence. Jalen's hands were deep in his pockets, his chin jutted out, his dark eyes reflecting the light, sharp and calculating. The prosecutor smacked his lips, flipping through the case file, but his expression had lost its initial confidence. Jalen's defense was as sharp as a knife, refuting each point with tight arguments, making even veteran lawyers frown in thought. He was not flustered, not panicked, on the contrary, each sentence was filled with weight. Next to Judge Grayson, the stenographer was trying to keep up with his arguments, but clearly couldn't keep up. A few giggles rang out when Jalen made the prosecutor flustered by a rebuttal question. Even a few court staff raised their eyebrows slightly, surprised by the young man's intelligence. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the polished wooden table. He looked at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, his lips slightly raised, a mixture of disdain and undisguised amusement. "You think you're a legal expert?" he asked, dry amusement in his voice. "This isn't debate club, kid." There was a laugh, but Jalen didn't react. He didn't smile, nor did he flinch. His eyes remained calm, as if he'd been preparing for this his whole life. He had. Jalen wasn't some brash teenager who was confident without reason. He'd spent years preparing for this moment. Not in the way he wanted to, not as a defendant, but he knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. When other kids played basketball, he memorized the rules. When his friends played video games, he argued with himself, solving imaginary cases. He'd grown up in the world of the law. His mother, Denise Dawson, had been a paralegal for more than 20 years. Jalen had heard hundreds of stories about the cases she'd worked on. He had seen his mother frustrated by the injustice of the legal system against the poor, had seen her stay up all night over thick files and still not be able to change the fate of those wrongly convicted. And now, standing before the judge, Jalen knew that he was not just fighting for himself. He was fighting for people like his mother, for people who had never had a chance to speak the truth. The prosecutor cleared his throat, trying to regain his balance. "Defendant, you may have some knowledge of the law, but that doesn't change the fact that you broke the law. You were charged with auto theft and resisting arrest. Do you think that just because you can talk well, you can get away with it?" Jalen looked straight at him, a small smile on her face. "I don't think I can get away with talking well, sir. I just think the system is unfair, and I'm going to prove it right now." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. No one laughed anymore. She brought home how prosecutors cut corners. How judges played favorites. How some defense attorneys barely tried. Jalen had absorbed it all by the time he was 14. Courtrooms, predetermined verdicts, lawyers who didn't care about their clients. He learned to observe, to read a judge's expression, to recognize the arrogance in a prosecutor's voice. He didn't need law school to understand that justice wasn't always served. He could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Judge Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another kid in trouble. "Let's get this over with." Grayson sighed, flipping through the case file with the laziness of a man used to keeping track of his time. "I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again, laughter mixed with frustration. It was a familiar scene, a man of power with no regard for the life before him. But this time, something had changed. Jalen's lips curved into a faint curve, a barely perceptible smirk. Because Grayson had just made his first mistake. But the courtroom hadn't noticed yet. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington rose from his seat with the air of a man who had won. His suit was crisp, his tie was tied perfectly, and his voice carried the confidence rehearsed over hundreds of previous trials. Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant Jalen Dawson was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6. Carrington emphasized each number as if it carried the weight of truth. This car was reported missing just hours before the arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution argued that the evidence spoke for itself. The words weighed heavily on the courtroom. The crowd in the gallery stirred, murmuring to one another. On the surface, the allegations sounded incontrovertible: a stolen car, a chase in progress. Judge Grayson glanced over the rim of his glasses at Jalen, his gray eyes cold, then back at Carrington. Go ahead. The prosecutor walked toward the jury, his polished shoes clicking on the parquet. He looked at them with confidence, as if the verdict were a foregone conclusion. The defense can try to convince you that it was all a misunderstanding. That he, Dawson, was just an unfortunate victim of circumstance. Carrington paused, turning to look at Jalen for the first time, his eyes as sharp as a scalpel. But let's be honest. The moment dragged on, the air heavy, as if he had just put an end to the case. Jalen remained seated, his eyes gleaming with a sharp glint. What Carrington didn't know, what the rest of the courtroom didn't know, was that Jalen was more than just a defendant. He was the only one in the room who had seen the truth from the beginning. The tension in the courtroom rose like a storm was brewing. The wooden chairs creaked as several people inched closer, waiting for the next development. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his chin resting on his hand, his gray eyes as sharp as a scalpel, examining every detail of the case. The air in the room was heavy. Jalen didn't blink. His eyes were dark, betraying no emotion. On the other side, Prosecutor Carrington flipped through the files slowly, as if each word was irrefutable evidence. Your Honor, Carrington said, his voice low and steady, I have here the statement of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. He held up a file, as if it were the final blow. The vehicle has been confirmed stolen. The arrest was made in due course. Judge Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. Sounds simple to me. And to most people in the room, it probably would have cleared the case. A stolen car. A chase. An arrest. Everything was clear. But Jalen had spent too many years studying trials to notice the cracks that remained. He watched silently, waiting. Every person in the courtroom was now a pawn in the game he was about to set up. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel on the table. All right, let's hear the defense's counterargument. He turned to Lisa Thornton, a public defender who had barely uttered 3 words since entering the room. Lisa stood, her eyes flickering. Your Honor, my client. Jalen placed a hand on her arm, a silent request that didn't require words. She hesitated, then sat down. And for the first time, Jalen spoke. I will represent myself, sir. The room fell into absolute silence. Grayson stared at him, clearly amused. Are you sure? Jalen's voice was calm and even. I am absolutely sure. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The bailiff raised an eyebrow. Carrington's lips curved into a smile, but it disappeared almost immediately. A sharp laugh escaped his throat. This should be interesting. But no one in the room laughed as Jalen took his first steps forward. They could all sense that something was changing. The pressure of the court was on Jalen as he adjusted his stance. His hands still in his coat pockets, he let the silence linger just long enough to make them all uncomfortable. A mind game had begun. And Jalen was the one holding the first piece. Before I begin, I want to confirm a few things with the prosecution. Carrington raised his eyebrows, crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes sharp as if he had anticipated Jalen's game. He took a step forward, challenging. Jalen took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm as he stepped forward. You said that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct? Carrington exhaled heavily, looking frustrated. And that testimony was written in his report. Jalen nodded, of course. He turned to Judge Grayson, his gaze firm. Your Honor, I hereby reject that testimony as evidence. Grayson frowned. On what basis? For the first time, Jalen pulled his hand out of his pocket, his eyes shining as if he had found a way out of a maze. He pointed toward the prosecutor's table, his voice firm. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A look of confusion crossed Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Jalen took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Judge Grayson. Your Honor, if the court allows, I'd like to file a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he saw me in the car, then his GPS data would prove it. But he let the sentence hang, creating a tense silence in the courtroom. A murmur rose from the audience. Several members of the jury exchanged suspicious glances. The atmosphere in the room suddenly became heavier. Grayson frowned and looked at Carrington. Carrington cleared his throat, but he couldn't hide his tension. His jaw clenched as he tried to regain his composure. That report was filed by a law enforcement officer, Your Honor. Are we really going to trust the defendant's word over a trained expert? Jalen shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. If the officer was where he said he was, the GPS data would prove it. But if not? He let the sentence hang, this time deliberately. A heavy silence fell over the room. No one had to say it, but everyone knew what was being implied. Judge Grayson looked at Jalen for a long moment, then turned to Carrington. Does the prosecution have any issues with verifying the police GPS logs? Carrington hesitated. The pause was long enough for the jury to notice. The gallery to notice. And most importantly, the judge to notice. The air in the courtroom suddenly felt heavier than ever. Jalen took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Carrington. Years of watching courtrooms, analyzing prosecutors' moves, dissecting their tactics had taught him one thing: if Carrington was truly confident in this case, he wouldn't hesitate. And right now, that hesitation was telling. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to shake off the headache that was slowly creeping in. On the other side, Carrington flipped through the file, his hands no longer as steady as before. His usual confidence was starting to crack. No objection, sir, Carrington finally said, but his voice was not as strong as before. The courtroom fell silent, a silence so heavy it was terrifying. If the room had been filled with whispers and mocking laughter before, now, no one dared to utter a word. The tension was like a bowstring being pulled to its limit. Carrington tried to regain his composure, rearranging the papers in front of him. But his fingers trembled slightly, the sharp edges of his confidence no longer smooth. Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen nodded slightly, not betraying any emotion. He knew he had just taken an important step forward, but now was not the time to celebrate. Let's talk about that evidence for a second. Grayson raised an eyebrow, signaling him to continue. Jalen turned to face the jury, his eyes moving from one to the other, as if he were speaking directly to them, not as a defendant, but as a human being seeking understanding. The prosecution wants you to believe that my fingerprints on the car mean I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But think about it rationally. He paused, letting his words sink in. Imagine you walk into a department store. You see a nice coat, you try it on, put your hand in the pocket, maybe zip it up to see if it fits. Then you put it back on the rack and leave. A few hours later, someone steals that coat. Jalen leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp. Just because your fingerprints are on it, does that mean you stole it? A few of the jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the courtroom muttered something, but Jalen didn't give them time to think about it for too long. The car we're talking about was parked in front of a 7-Eleven 11 hours before the burglary. I was there with 3 of my friends. And yes, when we passed the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was unlocked. He took a deep breath, his voice still calm but carrying a weight of conviction. I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. The silence stretched for a few more seconds. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on Jalen. He could see, in that moment, the seed of doubt had been planted in their minds. Just a moment of silly curiosity. Jalen let it go for a second. A brief moment, but long enough for every eye in the courtroom to freeze. Then he spoke, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Does touching something make you a criminal? Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes. His fingers trembled slightly as he searched, trying to grasp for something, anything, to regain control. But Jalen didn't give him the chance. And while we're on the subject, let's talk about how the fingerprint analysis was done. He turned to Grayson, his eyes shining with dangerous certainty. Sir, you're the forensic expert on this case, correct? You've been called to testify. Grayson blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. He glanced at Carrington, as if waiting for a signal, a direction. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly shook his head. Jalen's lips pressed into a thin line. So let me be clear. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me. But they didn't think it necessary to bring in an expert directly. The only expert who handled that evidence wasn't available for me to cross-examine. I can't ask about the chain of custody, can't challenge the accuracy of the analysis. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Carrington's jaw tightened, the telltale sign of someone who knew he was being backed into a corner. Jalen nodded, as if that was what he wanted to confirm. Interesting. His voice was small but it shook the room. Judge Grayson sighed, closing his eyes for a moment, pressing a finger to the bridge of his nose as if he could feel a headache coming on. It was the look of a man who had just realized this case was not going to be as easy a victory as he had thought. But Jalen wasn't done yet. He walked slowly forward, each step adding to the tension. His voice was steady but determined. Your Honor, I would like to present a new piece of evidence. An official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Judge Grayson frowned. The owner? Jalen nodded. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi. He provided a statement to the police. But for some reason, it was never filed with the prosecution. All eyes turned to Carrington. His face paled in an instant. Jalen didn't miss his chance. He turned, his eyes as sharp as knives. And I think I know why. He walked slowly toward Carrington, his words dripping with certainty and danger. Prosecutor, do you remember what Mr. Whitaker told the officers the night his car was reported stolen? Carrington's jaw clenched, his jaw twitching. He knew exactly what was coming, but he couldn't stop it. Jalen didn't wait for him to speak. Instead, he pulled a copy from his file, his eyes flashing like a sharp blade across the room. His voice rang out, clear, decisive. I left my car running when I pulled into the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But that wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid. And he was a white boy. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, like a cold wind sweeping through the silent people. A few shifted in their seats, a few exchanged skeptical glances. Jalen held the paper high, like an irrefutable declaration. This is from the original police report, he continued, his voice sharp as steel. The same report that the prosecution conveniently ignored. He turned, facing Judge Grayson. His eyes held the fire of a man who had suffered too much injustice and yet stood firm. The arresting officer admitted it in his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And now they want the jury to believe that I, a man who did not fit the description, was the real thief. I was convicted on mere assumptions and poor police work. Carrington stepped forward, his face ashen. He staggered, his voice urgent, "This is irrelevant, sir." The defendant was caught in possession of the car. But Jalen just shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "No, I did not." He did not raise his voice, but his words rang out like a sharp blade that tore through the tense atmosphere. He did not raise his voice, but each word rang out like a sharp blade that tore through the tense atmosphere. "I was arrested several blocks away from where the car was abandoned. I was walking home from a snack with friends. I wasn't in the car, I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing that ties me to this case is the police's negligence and hasty assumptions." Judge Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples, the sign of someone facing an undeniable truth. The case was falling apart right before everyone's eyes. Jalen turned to the jury, looking at each one of them. The real suspect escaped that night. The police just found a black kid in that area and decided that was close enough. That's the nature of this case. Silence fell over the courtroom. No one dared to breathe. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Does the prosecution have anything else to add?" Carrington stiffened, his face red with anger or shame, perhaps both. "No, sir." Judge Grayson gave Jalen a long look, the look of a man facing the stark truth, a truth that the entire legal system probably didn't want to acknowledge. Jalen glanced at the jury one last time. His eyes scanned each face, reading the tension, the disbelief, even the relief. Then he took a deep breath, leaned forward, and spoke. His voice was calm, each word weighted so that it seemed to be etched into the oppressive atmosphere of the courtroom. Those words would echo in the minds of everyone present today. Silence. A long, heavy silence. And then. "The case is dismissed." The moment seemed to last forever. Then the room exploded. Half in relief, half in anger. The murmurs rose, rolling like a tidal wave. The gallery was in an uproar, reporters scribbling in notebooks, cameras flashing like lightning in the stormy sky. Jalen did not rush to leave. He let the moment permeate every corner of the room, letting the truth take root in everyone's minds. He looked at Judge Grayson. The older man still held the gavel tightly in his hand. Something in his eyes had changed, something Jalen had never seen before. Recognition? Maybe. Regret, even. Jalen wasn't sure. But he knew he had made his mark. He turned away, walking toward the door. But just as his hand touched the heavy wooden door, the judge's voice spoke, stern but more subdued than before. "Mr. Dawson." Jalen stopped but didn't turn. There was a pause. Then Grayson continued, slowly, as if weighing each word. "You should consider law school." Jalen chuckled, a smile that was half mocking, half proud. He didn't need to think about it. He had his own path. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices, a steady stream of questions. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing, microphones held out like spears ready to pierce anyone who hesitated. "Jalen, did you know the case was going to be dismissed? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to beat a veteran prosecutor?" Jalen pulled up the hood of his hoodie, partially covering his face, and walked away without saying a word. He didn't care about the scene. This had never been about proving how smart he was. This was about something bigger. And then he saw her, Denise, his mother, standing at the bottom of the stairs. Her gaze was unreadable, her arms crossed, her lips pressed together. She didn't say anything in a hurry, just looked at him for a long time, as if searching his eyes for something. Finally, she sighed and shook her head. "You scared me half to death." Jalen laughed, scratching the back of his head, trying to look nonchalant. "You have to take the risk, Ma." She continued to look at him, a mixture of reproach and pride. Then, without another word, she stepped forward and hugged him tightly. A hug that was not rushed, that did not require words, but contained everything. All around, the flashbulbs were still flashing, the voices were still loud. But for Jalen, everything had faded. Because at this moment, there was only him and his mother. And a long road ahead waiting for him to continue. Across the street, standing next to his car, his eyes silently watched the last moments of the courtroom before the doors closed. Judge Grayson noticed the change in his posture. Gone was the haughty, cool confidence he had had when he had walked in that morning. Instead, there was a rare silence on his face, a quiet but profound look, as if he were looking through the world he had believed in. It wasn't pure disappointment, but something closer to enlightenment. He hadn't expected this. To him, this case had been just another day at work, another defendant, another guilty plea, another closed case in the hundreds of thousands that were filed in the system every year. But now, as he walked out of the courtroom, he knew he would remember this moment forever. Because Jalen had done something that not everyone could. He made the system look at itself. And for the first time, the system blinked. Grayson sighed. How many cases like this had happened? How many people had been convicted not because of evidence, but because of bias, because of convenient shortcuts, because of a system that put efficiency before truth? How many had been silently acquiesced because they didn't have the knowledge, the resources, to fight injustice? Jalen had the brains, the knowledge, to fight for himself. But what about the others? The ones who had no one on their side, no voice, no chance to prove the truth. Grayson clenched his fists. This wasn't just one case. It was a reminder of thousands of cases playing out the same way. And he knew he couldn't just stand by and watch. This courtroom wouldn't be Jalen's last. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He will become a lawyer. And when that day comes, he will not be alone. If this story makes you think, even for a moment, please share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it is run by people. And people can change. But only if we force them to change. Because the next time the person standing in the dock may not be Jalen. It may be someone you know.